Hey class, welcome to week 9. We're getting almost 2/3 of the way through the semester. So in this video, I'm going to talk about CSS, and we're going to apply some CSS styles to the website that we started last week. So this week, we're just going to go over some of the basics for CSS, and we will have to add a little bit of HTML as well. So we'll be editing a couple different files. But we're going to add some styles, some color, and typographic styles to our website, and we'll talk a little bit about how HTML and CSS fit together. And then I'll go over posting some updated documentation, and next week we have one more week on web development. I'll go over some advanced CSS stuff, doing some layouts, things like that. And then we will wrap up our web development project. So I'm on the web development page. I'm going to get started by going over to the P5 editor. And here we can see what we worked on last week. So I'm just going to run this real quick and take a look. And then we'll make a new project to start adding some styling. I think I mentioned this in a previous video. If you see this type error, that's just something that's happening on the back end. You can just ignore that. I think for our HTML project, you can pretty much just ignore anything that's in the console. So then if we look over here, we can see our website. We can see it's pretty basic. It's a little boring. There's no color, there's no interesting typography, and then our image is really large, so we can't actually see the whole thing within the window. And so that's what we're gonna work on today. We're just gonna introduce CSS and add a few basic styles. Before I get started with that, one thing that I'm going to do is start a new project. So we have our little web intro here. And one thing that's really nice about the P5 editor is we can duplicate a project and add to it. So that way, if we ever want to come back to the original project before we added CSS, we can always come back and look at it. So I would recommend doing this. This is also a good chance, if you guys, I'll link to these templates in the YouTube video. So you can always grab my example and duplicate it, make a copy, and then use that as a template to start editing your own project. So anyway, I'm going to get started with that. So I'm going to go to File and click Duplicate. And you'll see it turns the name of the project into Web Intro Copy. So I'm just going to update the name and say CSS Basics and put Spring 2024. Here, and I'm going to add this to our MMP 100 Spring 2024 collection. So we've got that on there now. And so there's a couple things we need to add in our HTML before we get started with our style sheet. I'll quickly just explain exactly why we're going to do that. So I'll just make a little sketch. So we're going to be adding CSS, and one of the things that we'll see that CSS does in a few different ways is it makes it easy to apply styles to many different things. So actually, let me run this. And so we can see we have we have this header, this H1 here. We have a paragraph here. We have a paragraph here. And a paragraph here. And then we also have these pages that link out to other HTML pages. And the way CSS is designed is it's set up so that we can apply one rule. So we're going to apply one rule that can apply to everything on the page, so everything here. But we can also apply a rule just to our paragraphs. And then we can also apply rules that affect every single HTML page. So it really is very modular, and it makes it very easy to set one basic guideline or rule for a design and then apply it across your website. So our website is very simple. It wouldn't really be that hard to go in and go to each paragraph and say, I want to change the color. But as websites get more complex with many pages and lots of content, it becomes very difficult to manage those styles unless you have a system like this. So there's a few ways that CSS does that. We'll look at a couple of those today. Let's just get started with our CSS. So in our HTML, in order to connect our CSS, we are going to have to add an extra tag into the head section. So again, remember the reason that this goes in the head section, and actually let me add some notes here. because I didn't actually go over this last time, but you can write something called comments in your HTML and CSS. This is something I should have mentioned before, but had kind of a long video last time. Comments are basically just a way of taking notes so that it gets ignored by the website. So for example, in HTML, if I want to write a comment, I can make a tag that kind of looks like this. It uses a little exclamation point and a couple dashes. And then I can write whatever I want and it'll get ignored by the browser. So I can make a note like head is for metadata that does not appear on page. And then I can close that comment. And now if I run my website again, you'll see that that doesn't appear anywhere. So this is just a way for us to take notes for ourselves, and if you're collaborating with somebody, for other developers to know what's happening. So in our head section, that's where we add metadata, again, that doesn't appear on the page. So we have our title, which is what appears in Google search results or the browser bar. Even though the title is the same as our header here, it doesn't have to be. So you can have a different title for the website and a different header on different pages. Another thing that we want to put in the head section is a link to our style sheet. The reason we have it here is because it's not something that actually appears in the page of the website, even though it affects the page of the website. So the way that I do this is sort of similar to our anchor tag that we covered last week, but it's a little bit different because we're adding a style sheet that applies to this page. So there's a special tag for this, which is called link. And the link doesn't have a closing tag because it's just going out and retrieving another document. It doesn't have its own content, but it does have some attributes. So remember, let me turn up my font size a little bit. Okay, I think that's better. Okay, so remember our attributes are things like our href for our hyperlink, or our source, or our alt text for our image. These are things that go inside of one of our tags. So it goes in between the name of the tag and the bracket at the end. So I just put a space here and start writing an attribute. So the style sheet has a few attributes. The first is an href, just like our link. This is just saying where to get this document. So we put an equal sign and then quotation marks for the value of the document. And we're just going to put this right on our main file directory next to index.html. So we'll just link to it there. So I'm just going to call this style.css. You can really call it whatever you want as long as it ends in .css. You'll be fine. There are a couple of other attributes that help the browser know what it's looking for. So we set the type of document that we're linking to, and this is text/CSS. So this just tells the browser what type of data it's going to look for. And then we set this attribute called rel, or relationship, and this is style sheet. So that's all we have to do to link to our styles. And then we'll make our style sheet, and then there's a few other things that we'll go over, but that's where we're going to get started. So that's actually all we have to add here. We may come back to our HTML page if we need to, but for now I think this is good. So I'm going to make my style sheet now. So I'm going to go to the sketch files and click plus and create a file, and I'm just going to name this style.css. Make sure you have the all lowercase, or at least matching. You probably have run into this at some point already, but the uppercase versus lowercase actually makes a difference here. So make sure you have the right lowercase style if you have lowercase style here. So in style.css, we can also write comments. So in a style sheet, the syntax is a little bit different than HTML. So we're going to get started with some just basic stuff. So we'll just get used to it. But it is like they're related, but syntactically different languages. So in CSS, if I want to make a comment, I make a slash and then an asterisk. And then I can write whatever I want here, and this gets ignored. It's not part of the style sheet. And so I'm going to put some notes here, and then when we're done with our comments, we put another asterisk and a slash. And I want to tab over, so when you see the cursor go over like that, I'm hitting tab just to move over, just so we know that this is part of the comment. And you'll notice that P5 editor adds in this little arrow here, which we can collapse just to make it more readable later on. So CSS, just a couple notes here. This stands for cascading style sheets. And so what cascading means, it has to do with the way that our rules apply to the different parts of our page. And we'll see an example of that in a second. And then style, of course, just refers to the visual style of the website. And then sheets is just our documents. Okay, so when we're writing CSS, there's some basic syntax. So let's go over the syntax basics. So the first part of our CSS rule, in CSS we have a series of rules. And in those rules, we define what styles we want for different parts of our page. So a rule starts with what's called a selector. Okay, so let's say a CSS rule. So there starts with a selector. Okay, a selector can be any HTML element. So that could be like H1 or P or body or anchor tag, image. All of those are selectors. So we select the part of the website that we want to style. So then we have a property. These are things that we want to style, like the color, the font size is another property. There's lots and lots of properties. We'll look at that in just a second. And then we have a value. This is things like blue for a color or 18 pixels for the font size. So the way that these all fit together is we have selector. So we have a selector and then we have curly brackets. Okay, so this is a little bit different from HTML, although it does look similar to other programming languages like JavaScript that we'll look at next week. But we have these curly brackets and say this is where so we have our selector and then we have, this is our rule, and then we have the properties that we want to assign. So we have property 1, and then we have a colon, and then we have a value, and then we have a semicolon. So we have a property and a value. And then we can do as many of these as we want. So our next one might be property 2, and there's a value there. And we can keep going for as long as we want. And then when we're done, we go to our next selector. And then we have our brackets, and then we continue on from there. So we'll see some examples of this, but that's the basic syntax. If you want to, there's a lot of CSS rules. So just like our HTML, people don't memorize these things. You get used to them, so you start to memorize them as you use them. But really what you need to do is just know how to look things up. So basically when you want to look something up, let's say you're looking at a website. Let's say we can go to newyorktimes.com, which is one I like to use because there's just a lot of content. So you can, look around and see all these things, and you might think, well, what is this? And I can right click on this and go to inspect. And this will bring up in Chrome this little inspector window. Let me hide myself for a second. And then you can see all of these different properties of our HTML. You can see all the HTML on the website. And then you can also see the styles down here. And so this is a good way to get a sense of what different styles are how different styles work. So for example, if you wanted to know how this style worked, we could click inspect here, and we can see the rules here. So there, it has a font family, it has a font size, it has a bunch of other styles like letter spacing, text transform. This site is going to be a little bit more complicated, but normally what we would do is just say CSS. Let's say you wanted to change the color. I would say colors. And then we look for either MDN or other websites. And I'll show you guys some examples of different websites that are useful. So here on MDN, if you look at CSS, there's a lot of different references that are really useful. So you can see all of the CSS properties here. There's a ton of them. So you're not going to be able to memorize those. You can see all the selectors here. If you want to see a list of all of them, I would just search CSS properties, and I would look at the MDN reference, and you can see all of the different properties here. So there's quite a lot of them. CSS has really gotten very complex, but we're just going to start with the basics for today. So that's our CSS reference. So let's write our first CSS rule. We're just going to start with something very simple. We're going to use the body selector. And if we look at our HTML for just a second, you'll see that the body selector is here. And that's basically the body of our entire document. So if I go back to CSS, if I select body, so I'll just say I want to apply some rules to the body. I add some curly brackets, which I use the bracket keys. If you haven't used these before, they're up here next to between the P and the slash key. And the curly brackets are the ones on the top, so you have to use shift to get those. And so we just say the selector that we want, which is the body, and then we use the curly brackets, and then we can define as many rules as we want in here. So if I change the color, this is a little bit weird. This is one weird rule where it doesn't actually, it's not very specific. It's like the color of what? It happens to be the color of the text. So if I change the color to purple, and then I run my site again, now all the text is purple. If I set it to red, now the text is all red. And so we can, define rules like that. It's very simple. One thing that P5 does that a lot of modern editors do is it actually adds a little color picker here. This is not part of your text, but P5 is adding it here. And it is actually convenient. If you want a different color, you can find a nice color and hit enter, and it's gonna add that color in there. So if I run this again, you can see now I have this new color. So you'll notice that this color is applying not just to the header or the paragraphs, but everything on the page. So that's what the cascading refers to. Anything that's inside of the body is going to get the styles that the body has. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, although it doesn't always work exactly that way. Most of the time it does. There's this hierarchy. So for example, if I change the color, this blue we can't really see, but let's say I change the color to pink. You'll notice that the anchor tags, the links, are still blue. So some rules have priority over other rules. And so if we wanted to change those anchor tags, we would have to change those specifically. Okay, so I don't actually want to change all of the color of the body, but let's change the background color. So if I want to change the background color, I can type in background. Notice that P5 has some helpful hints for us here. So it knows all of the different rules, and it's going to give us some hints. And so we can look for the one that we want once we start. And there we see background color. And it's also good because it shows you some of the other rules that you might want to use. So let's set our background color. And then here's a good point where we might want some other resources. So another website that is very useful is HTML color codes. So in this website, this is one I really like because it shows you several different types of data. So we have this color picker where we can just move this dot around and change the color and look at different hues and saturation and lighter or darker. And then it gives us 3 different versions of that color. The one that we usually want to use for CSS is this hex value. That's the shortest one. It's the easiest one to kind of copy and paste over to our CSS. But it also has a section of names, which is useful. In here, it has all of the different, CSS has these like defined names for colors, for specific colors. So there's millions of colors that you can use, and any color that you can represent through RGB, like we did in Photoshop and Illustrator, you can also represent in CSS. But there's some basic colors that it has names for. So let's say we want a green background for our website. We can go to the green area, and then we can see there's some nice different greens. We can find something that might fit our design. Anything that you like is fine here. I kind of like this light sea green, so I'm just gonna copy that. But notice it has 3 different values. It has the name of the color in CSS. It has the hex value, which we could also copy. It also has an RGB value. So this is the actual RGB numbers that make up the color. So I'm just gonna copy the name here, and I'm gonna go back and paste it right there. Just Command C, Command V, or Control C, Command V. And then I'm going to hit Command Enter to reload my website. And now we have a nice blue color. So that's really nice to get started. We can also change a couple other things here, and then we'll add some other components. So let's add a few more rules. I'm going to collapse my notes up here. So we'll add a couple more rules that we normally want to add to the body, and then we might go over a few more things. So another thing that I might want to do, since this website is very text heavy, but there's actually not, it's a lot of reading, but there's not that much text. I might want to make the font size bigger. So if I type in font, you're going to see there's a lot of different rules related to the font. The font is just the typography that's used for the text, and there's lots of different rules that we can do with the font. So if I go to font size, I can change the font size. And there's different units for this. Units are different ways that we measure things. The easiest one to use is just pixels, which is px. This is just really straightforward. The number of pixels that we put is how tall the font is. So if I say I want it to be 20 pixels, I think the default is 16, and I run it. Notice that my H1 actually didn't change because it's larger than that. Well, actually it did change, but it's relative. So one of the things that's a little, that's very convenient, but also a little confusing about CSS is that certain rules are relative versus absolute. So the pixels are absolute number of pixels, but our headers have a relative value. So it actually multiplies whatever our base font size is. But we can see our paragraphs are bigger, our header is bigger. If we go larger, you see everything is even larger. So we can set a font size, maybe 22 is good. It's nice and readable. You can play around with that to get what you want. And then we can also change the typography by changing the font family. So the font family refers to the style of the font. There's a really good website for this called CSS Font Stack. And one of the reasons I like this website is that it actually shows you on Mac and Windows, there's different levels of support for different font families, and it'll show you what they are. So for example, these are some sans serif fonts, which you'll learn about this more in your design class, but this basically is more modern fonts that don't have the little feet at the bottom and edges like you see with serif fonts. So serif fonts are more traditional fonts for things like newspapers and books. Sans serif fonts are more modern fonts for things like websites and advertisements and things like that. But when you look at this, you can see these different fonts that are available, and you can see some are supported on Mac, but not on Windows, and some are the other way around, like over here, this is all Windows and no Mac, and then some have a decent amount of support on both, like this Tahoma is both on Windows and Mac. So that's a good thing to use. These are the default built-in fonts that every browser comes with, but we can also get fonts from other places, and we'll look at that in just a second. So let's choose a font here that has decent support. Now that I'm looking at it, there isn't really great support for both Mac and Windows with a lot of these fonts. Let's see. Warrior New has decent support on both. You can try that one. That's sort of like a typewriter font, might be kind of fun. So with this font, I need to use quotation marks here. I can put Courier New, and that changes the font. The reason we need quotation marks here is because of that space, although it actually looks like it works without this quotation mark. So maybe it works in some cases not. So we can change the font that way. Another thing that we can do is add fonts from external sources. So Google has a font library that's really useful if you go to fonts.google.com. And this one is a little trickier to use. I'm gonna go away for a second and we'll look at this. So you can kind of scroll through these different fonts, and if you find something that you like, this is one that looks kind of new. I haven't seen that one before, but it's kind of nice, kind of simple. You can click on this Get Font button, and you can actually download the files from the font, but we don't really need to do that. What we can do is embed it in the website. So if you click on Get Embed Code, it actually shows you some different options here. There's a lot in here to go over, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but the easiest way to do it is just go to Import, and then it actually makes a rule for you here in CSS, but it has these style HTML elements that we really don't need. So you can copy this, but it's going to copy that style into your document, and that's going to create an error. What you really want is just to copy this import line. So we can go back and we can put this here. The only trick with this is it has to go before you use it. It really has to go at the top of your document. So we're going to import this font, and I don't know why they don't have a semicolon at the end, but that's going to create an error. So just throw a semicolon in there. And then you can see the rule right here. So again, I don't need all of this, so I'm just going to copy this font family rule. And I'm going to go back here. And if I paste this down here, you're going to see that this rule is going to overwrite the previous rule. So that's another thing with CSS. If you have multiple rules, it's going to take whatever the last one was, because it's just going to load them in order. But what I'm going to do is comment out the Courier new. That's another shortcut that's really useful. Is if you hit Command and / or question mark, it'll add a comment around the line that you're on, and that means it'll ignore that code, but we can easily bring it back later if we want to. So let's talk about this rule for a second, and then we'll continue. So you can see we have the font family here, which is the one we loaded from Google, but then there's a comma and it says sans serif. And so this is just called a fallback. So if for some reason this doesn't load, if the internet connection is slow, or maybe if there's a typo in the URL and it's spelled wrong, this is a backup, so that if this one fails, then we'll have a sans serif, and that's just used to match the basic font. So let's imagine I have a typo here. Notice that it's a sans serif, versus if I didn't have a fallback, it goes back to the main default, which is a serif font. So that's just to have a similar backup font. That's why it looks like that. Okay. So let's go over a couple of things. So we've added some style to our body. That looks pretty good. So now I want to show how cascading works again with another example. So let's imagine again that we have a color for our text. So I'm going to set the color to, let's set it to yellow. Okay, that stands out nicely against the green. So notice that that applies to every single one of our text. But let's say we didn't want our paragraphs to be yellow. I could use a new paragraph rule, and I could set the color to white. Or I could set it back to the default black. So this is another thing that CSS does to make it really easy to style stuff. We can set a color that affects everything on the website, but if we set a different color that we only want to affect our paragraphs, you can see it affects the paragraphs, but not the main color. So this is also how the cascading aspect works, where it sets these rules in this sort of like hierarchy. So I sort of actually liked the white color for the paragraphs against the dark green that I've got going. So I'm going to go back to that. And then of course I can change the other aspects of my paragraph, like the font size or other things like that. I can also set rules for my H1. So for example, for my H1, let's say I didn't want my header to be quite as large. I could set the font size to 1 EM, and now it's going to match the paragraph. So this EM is a relative unit. It essentially just multiplies whatever our base font size is here by 1. So if I set that to 1.5, it's a little bit bigger. The default for an H1 is 2. And if you don't like that, you could set it to 1.5. So there's these relative units. I'll put a little note here that says M is relative unit multiplies base font size. So whatever you do that, it's going to be that times whatever the main font size that you set here. Okay, so we see a little bit about how cascading works, and notice our anchor tags are still blue. That's because the anchor takes precedence over other things that come before it. So if we want to change the anchor tag color, we can put an A here, and we can say color is pink. And now we'll have pink links. So different rules kind of apply differently. And again, it's just, you don't really need to memorize this stuff. It's something that we just kind of get used to. And if we don't know the rules, we can look them up. I'm going to add one more rule, but then I'm going to go over applying these styles to the rest of our website. And then, there's lots of other rules to explore. I recommend, going on MDN and looking for other rules and seeing if there's other stuff we can add. So one other thing that I want to do, this is really more of a layout thing, which is something that we'll focus on next week. But our image is way too large. And so there's a couple ways that we can fix that. So this is another chance to look at some relative versus absolute rules. So we can set the width of the image. So I'm going to use the IMG, which is just the image tag. So it's going to select every image on our website. And if I set the width value, I can set it to like 100 pixels. And it's just going to be exactly 100 pixels. So that's a little bit small. So maybe we can set it to 200 pixels. You know, that looks good. That looks okay. But this is called an absolute scale. So I'll put a note here, absolute units, pixels. And so that means regardless of the size of the website, if you're on your phone or on your computer, it's always going to be exactly 200 pixels of screen space. We can also set these values. I'm just going to put a comment here using relative units. So relative units are things like percentages, or we saw EMs for our font. So if I say the width is 100%, that means it's going to take up 100% of the window. So if I change the size of the window, notice that the image also changes size. So this is really convenient because it's going to change if you're on a phone, if you're on a computer, if you change the size of your browser, the image is just going to fill whatever that size is. That makes sense in this very simple layout where we just have content sort of layered on top of each other, just from the top to the bottom. It might not make sense in other contexts, so we'll talk about layout a little bit more next week. But for now, we're just going to keep things simple. I'm going to go to edit and tidy up my code. Oh, it does kind of a weird thing with my comments if they're too long. So let's fix that. Okay, let's tidy again. Okay. Okay, so now the last thing that I want to go over is how do we apply these rules to multiple pages. So that's the other thing with CSS, is that basically our goal is our HTML, our website is going to have a home page, which is our index page, but then it's also going to have lots and lots of other pages. And instead of defining styles for every single page, what we can do is we're going to have one style sheet, and we're going to apply that to all of our pages. So they'll all have the same styles. And if you have specific styles, you can add some extra styles to a single page if you want one page to look a little bit different. But we're going to start by adding our style sheet to every single page. So right now, if I click on like my animator link, we see the old style. And same thing with the designer link. So if we want to fix that, we can use our link tag in our HTML, but apply it to our other HTML pages. So I'm going to go to HTML, I'm going to open this up, and I'm just going to paste it in there. But you're going to notice, remember last time we talked about the path for our links, we use this .. slash. That's going to apply here as well. So our page is inside the page folder, but we're referring to a style sheet that's out here in the main folder. So we have to go back to the main folder. So if I run this as is, it's still not going to link. But if I put a little .. slash at the beginning, it's going to go back to our main folder. And now if I go to the animator page, let me run this again. Am I on the animator page? Oh, I didn't save it. Make sure you save it. Okay, let's go to the animator page. Okay, we still don't see it. Okay, so we might have to debug a little bit. Let's try it on the designer page. I'm gonna put this in here. Let's say .style.css. And let's go to designer. Okay, so I'm not sure why it's not running. What I'm gonna do is just refresh the window. That might fix some things. Sometimes the P5 backend is not super fast. So let's try it again. Go to animator. Okay, I'm gonna try a hard refresh. Okay. Let's see if I have any typos. Let's go to animator.html, saying .. slash style.css.